Life in Paris or life in New York? Which one's better? That's what we're gonna get into today. And for all things about life in Paris as told by an American who's living here, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, I'm Tiff. I'm an American living in Paris, here to help you navigate life abroad, navigate life in Paris, help you jump outside of your comfort zone and successfully set yourself up in a new country if that's something that you want to do. So today, we're going to compare life in Paris to life in New York City. And this topic was actually requested by one of my followers, having known that I've lived in both New York City and Paris. So for those of you guys who haven't been following me, I have lived in New York City. So I was actually living in New York City for 2 years before moving to Paris, and now have been living in Paris for 3 years. So I did think that this could be a really cool topic to share with you guys, American city life versus European city life, and for you to choose for yourself which one you would rather. So I'll be comparing life in New York City to life in Paris in regards to a bunch of different categories like food, cost of living, quality of living, pace of life, the people, transportation. I mean, there's so many things on this list. We have a lot to cover, so let's get into it. All right, so first let's start with the people. So comparing New Yorkers to Parisians. So let's start with New York. So I know that this isn't true for everyone who's living in New York, but just speaking to kind of the general consensus of the people who live here, I do think that New Yorkers are the go-getters. They're the hustlers. They're the people who crave some sort of financial success, at times want to make all the money in the world. And I feel like Parisians are a bit more slow moving. They're usually okay with what they have and don't always crave so much more. They really value the simple things in life, I would say. Although you do have, the hustlers and the go-getters and the competitive people kind of sprinkled in, I do think that they are more about just enjoying life. And there actually is a saying that I'm sure you guys have heard before, that in America, people live to work, and in France, people work to live. And I think that this is also the best way to describe the difference between New Yorkers and Parisians as well. So if I personally had to pick between, the New Yorkers' way of life and the Parisian way of life, I'm kind of leaning more towards the Parisian way of life, although I am also a hustler. But I do have to say I kind of like the slow moving, just enjoy everyday life versus the hustle, hustle, hustle all the time. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents on that. So then second on my list is the pace of life. So the overall pace in everyday living. I do personally feel like New York is very, very fast. And Paris, although it is also a very busy city, it's a lot slower than things are in New York City. And it's funny because I had spent a year in Paris and then went back to New York for a summer to visit friends. And I remember going back and being like, oh my God, New York is so fast. How did I live here for 2 years? It actually took me being out of the city to actually realize how fast New York City really is. So yeah, I'm a lot more comfortable with the pace of Paris as it stands right now. I still love New York, and it still has a place in my heart. But in regards to everyday life, I think I do prefer kind of the slow moving versus the super, super fast way of life. So next up is cost of living, and I actually just did a cost of living in Paris video for my channel where I break down some of my monthly expenses of living in Paris. And if you've watched that video, you probably see that some of my expenses are a lot lower of a cost compared to in New York City or some areas in the United States. But when you actually do the conversion to USD and you take into consideration that the salaries in Paris are a lot lower than New York City, I feel like the cost of living is about the same. I think that both cities can be expensive when you visit. I also feel like in both cities you can find a more affordable way to live. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on the cost of living when you compare New York City to Paris. But I do have to say, having been a student in Paris and having worked here, I do feel like there are a lot more benefits that you can take advantage of when you are living in Paris, so definitely something to keep in mind. So next on my list is fashion. So in my opinion, I do think New Yorkers are a bit more trendy and a bit more eclectic than Parisians. Here, it's a lot more effortless, chic, classic, which I also really love. So it just kind of depends on what you like. I feel like I'm a mix of both. I mean, I actually wear the same things in Paris that I was wearing in New York City. So I feel like my style has evolved, but hasn't changed drastically. And then next up is food. Oh my gosh, y'all know I love to eat. So I do think that Paris and New York both have amazing food, and I think they both pride themselves on international cuisine, which y'all know I love. Like, I feel like in both New York and Paris, I can find American food, I can find Italian food, I can find Vietnamese food. I don't know about Senegalese food in New York. I don't know if I wasn't really into Senegalese food when I was living in New York. You know, I've kind of discovered it here in Paris, but I do think that in both cities, you have so many great options. I think the only thing that's different about Paris, you know, being in France, is that here in France, the food laws are very strict. So, you know, you won't find a lot of chemicals in your food or anything like that, versus in America, it's a little bit different. So that's what I can say about the food. Amazing food choices in both cities for sure. I don't think I love one over the other, but when it comes to like the quality of the food and things like that, just because France has more strict rules around food, I think that the quality of the food tends to be a little bit better here. So now let's get into work-life balance. So when I was living in New York City, I was working in PR. I was managing lifestyle, beauty, and fashion clients. There were a lot of late nights. Some competition for sure, but it was kind of like a smaller boutique agency, so it wasn't as crazy as like a corporate setting. I will also say there was a lot of hustle that went into it. Some, you know, crazy managers, which wouldn't be the first time I experienced that in my life. But I do have to say, working in Paris, it was a lot of the same. So when I was working, you know, in corporate here in Paris, I was working in the luxury beauty industry, and I was a creative and digital manager. And I do have to say, it was very similar to what I experienced in New York City. But I do have to say that the benefits of my job here in Paris were by far a lot better than what I was getting in New York City. I mean, for starters, 5 weeks of vacation my first year working here, versus I think in New York City I had like altogether 10 days of vacation. So there was that. Also benefits like ticket restaurant, which is where the company gives you some money for food every day. So I think when it comes to the actual work setting, it was very similar, but working in Paris, I definitely had a lot more of actual work benefits that were very helpful and useful for me. And also, guys, as I'm going through each category, please let me know which city you would prefer. And also, if you've lived in Paris or New York or both, definitely let me know your thoughts on all of this. I would love, love, love to hear from you. Now let's get into things to do. So things to do in New York City versus things to do in Paris. So I have to say, in both cities, I feel like there are a lot of free things to do. Like, there are beautiful parks, museums, you know, so I feel like they're very similar on that front. I feel like for me, I prefer Paris just because there are a lot of things that I haven't done yet and can explore more, versus in New York, you know, I've pretty much have seen it all. So that's what I can say about both of them. You know, I feel like in New York City, I was doing a lot of eating out, going to parks, you know, nightlife in New York was a big thing for me. I love the nightlife in New York, versus here in Paris, still restaurants, still parks, but I feel like I haven't really explored a lot of the nightlife in Paris as much as I did in New York City. You know, I found a few places in Paris that I like, but in my opinion, the nightlife in New York City is poppin' and trumps all other nightlife. I'm sorry, Paris, I love you, but I gotta give it to New York City. But yeah, nightlife, Paris versus New York, I would definitely pick New York City. Restaurants, I feel like both have amazing restaurants. Outdoor stuff, I feel like Paris has a lot of beautiful parks, where I feel like in New York City, I was kind of only going to Central Park, so I feel like maybe they differ there. So yeah, I have to say, both have amazing things to do. Whether you don't really want to spend too much money or you do have the money to spend, I feel like there is not a shortage of options in either city. Now moving on to the cleanliness of New York City in Paris. So New York, I feel like wherever I walked, I smelled pee. I feel like I always saw trash piled up. The metros weren't the cleanest. But overall, I mean, it wasn't horrible. And I feel like in Paris, it's pretty much the same. I mean, I smell pee a lot here. There's a lot more dog crap here than there is in New York City, because I think there's a law, right, in New York City where you have to pick up your dog's poop, where here in Paris, I don't think that they have that same law. So they definitely differ on that front. And I have to say, I do think that the metro here, so the subway here, is a lot cleaner than the subway in New York City, so I think that that's a clear distinction for me. And also, I don't see as much like trash piled up on the street here in Paris, and I feel like I definitely saw a lot of that in New York City. So yeah, that's what I have to say for the cleanliness. So now let's talk about housing. So I kind of feel like in both New York City and Paris, it's about the same, you know, paying a lot of money for a tiny, tiny space. I mean, my very first apartment in Paris, if you guys have seen my video about getting kicked out of my apartment, it was super tiny. It was just like a little studio apartment that I was paying way too much money for. And then in New York City, I kind of lucked out a bit because I was living in the Bronx with two of my really good friends. So we lived in a pretty nice sized townhouse. It was 2 floors. It had washer and dryer. So I didn't really have to go through living in a tiny, tiny apartment in New York City. Although at first when we were touring apartments, I mean, there were so many apartments that we saw that were very, very small. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this with 3 people. So yeah, I honestly feel like New York City and Paris in terms of the size of the housing is about the same. But I also kind of think I lucked out with my apartment in Paris as well. So I live in a 1-bedroom apartment and it's a really nice size for Paris. You know, a lot of people that come over are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you found this apartment for this size and for this price. But I do feel like typically if you're living in New York City or Paris, you will be living in an overpriced box. So now let's talk about black hair care and black beauty salons in New York City versus Paris. So I feel like in New York City, I was mainly going on like Harlem 125th Street to get my hair done and was going to a lot of the beauty supply shops and salons around that area. I think there was 1 or 2 in Brooklyn that I had gone to, but Harlem 125th was like my hub, was where I could find everything. And here in Paris, I'm usually going to Chateau d'Eau to get all of my hair stuff. And honestly, I kind of feel like Chateau d'Eau reminds me a lot of Harlem 125th. I think the difference is when I would go like on Harlem 125th to get my hair done, there would be women on the street kind of trying to advertise for their services. But here in Paris and in the area of Chateau d'Eau, it's usually men who are on the street, you know, trying to get women into the salons. And that's something that I really had to get used to. You know, men just kind of aggressively coming up to you, you know, asking if you need to get your hair done, asking you if you want to go into a beauty shop. I mean, I've said in other videos, like one guy even poked me. So I definitely think that people who are trying to get you to go into the shops are a bit more aggressive here in Paris than they are in New York City for sure. And I have to say, just because of how aggressive the men are in Paris, I definitely prefer the New York City kind of black hair care, black hair salon, black beauty shop type of area. So next up is shopping, which we of course have to talk about shopping, Paris versus New York. So I feel like in New York, you know, the luxurious place to shop is Fifth Avenue, where I feel like here in Paris, it's the Champs-Élysées. I think that both have, you know, these outdoor shopping areas, but I do think that Paris actually has more inside shopping. So like malls with like all of the designer luxury items, as well as malls with like the Zaras and the Mangos. Whereas I feel like New York is more so, you know, the outdoor shopping malls. And actually, I think when I was living in New York, I always really liked shopping in Soho. I think it was Prince Street. And here I really like shopping on Rue de Rivoli. So it's right by Hotel de Ville. So I feel like those areas were kind of comparable. But I mean, guys, New York or Paris, you can find great shopping in either city for sure. But I do have to say in Paris, I absolutely take advantage of the soldes. So the big sales that happen twice a year. So once in the winter around January, and then another, pretty sure it's around June or July. And I usually go all out because the prices are just ridiculous. Like they're so good. So that's definitely something that I love about shopping in Paris. So then getting into transportation. So honestly, transportation in New York and in Paris is pretty much the same. Paris, I use the metro. In New York City, I use the subway. They both can be really confusing if you haven't navigated them before. I mean, yes, you can get around by car here if you really wanted to. Same with New York City, but it is very stressful. There is a lot of traffic. And honestly, I kind of think that taking the subway in New York City prepared me for Paris. But actually, I think in general, living in New York City prepared me for Paris. You know, city living is very different from life in the suburbs, and I grew up in a suburb. So definitely something to know if you are moving to either New York City or Paris from a suburb. So next up, I wanted to chat about the weather. So of course, in both cities, you do experience all 4 seasons. But in New York City, it can get extremely cold, like so cold. cold. And one of the biggest reasons why I love Paris so much too is that it really doesn't get as cold as in New York City or even Boston, which is where I'm originally from. So here, I mean, during the winter time, I think it usually gets around like 40 degrees. I mean, honestly, this winter it hasn't dipped. I don't think it's dipped below like 30 degrees at all. I mean, it snowed a few times, but it really doesn't get like that freezing cold. Whereas in New York City, I mean, we had 8-degree days, you know, where it would be freezing. It'd be so cold. And I hate the cold. Like I hate being cold. So I definitely prefer Paris on that front. But both cities experience all 4 seasons. The summers in New York City are super hot. The summers in Paris are super, super hot. And I feel like in both, you know, I've had that experience like where I've gotten off the train and I'm like dripping because it's just so hot underground, which I'm sorry guys, I know that's like TMI and kind of disgusting, but yeah, both experience all 4 seasons, but I do have to say I prefer Paris a lot more just because it doesn't get as cold. And then the very last thing that I wanted to compare for you guys is the overall quality of life. So in New York, I do feel like it is very fast-paced, you know, success-driven, hustle, 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 can be kind of stressful, where I feel like Paris, although yes, there is some stress because it's, you know, very busy, very crowded, it is a lot more, you know, slow-moving, all about enjoying life. There's hustle, but there's less of it. I feel like I'm split in the middle, you know? I feel like I'm definitely all about achieving success and things like that, but I also really love the kind of slow-moving way of life. I feel like just from living in Paris in general, I feel like I've been able to relax a bit more and just enjoy my time here, you know, outside of the, you know, at times stressful work environment, which I feel like you can find in both Paris and New York. But I just do think that people just, you know, they value the simple things in life here, you know, just taking a nice walk, sitting in a park. It's not really always all about that hustle, 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 go, 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 super fast pace. I think it's a lot more slow moving here, which I really love. So yeah, that's what I can say about the quality of life. You know, I don't necessarily think that one is better than the other. I just think that they're very different and in their own right. So guys, that's all from me on some of the similarities and differences between life in New York City and life in Paris. What did you guys think and which city do you prefer? Definitely let me know in the comments. And if you've lived in Paris or New York City or even both, I would love, love, love to hear from you. And for more tips and tools about navigating life in Paris and navigating life abroad in general, make sure to get on my email list and also subscribe to my channel because I share a lot of great content about life in Paris. And if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and you'll probably also really love this video where I talk about your assumptions about life in France, French culture, French people, and what my thoughts are about those. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.